Promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Gone are the days of wrestling with our favorite LJN wrestling figures, trying to convince them to stand up. What's a guy to do? I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to get on Etsy and look up 4 Left 3D Creations and get yourself these amazing custom LJN figure stands. There is a custom stand available for every single one of your LJN wrestling superstar figures. Make your display shine by grabbing these custom LJN stands from 4 Left 3D Creations today.
Hello, everybody. Jason of New Age Revolution Cave for a beautiful Friday on the big show. We are talking about my 30 most memorable wrestling moments. We are up to number 7. That's right, number 7. As we reminisce about, all of the things, all of the events and iconic experiences that wrestling brought me throughout childhood. And obviously some adulthood, I suppose. There will be one on here. There will be one on the list that is from adulthood. But until then, we're at number 7. And I actually have 7 and 8 figured out, but I'm going to decide right here and now which one I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this one. So my 7th most memorable wrestling moment is how much exposure we had to wrestling as a result of cable TV. And number 7 most memorable wrestling memory is finding other wrestling randomly on cable and getting to experience it also. What I mean is, if you were a wrestling fan in the 80s, it's likely that you were a WWF fan. Yes, of course, based on your where you lived, you might have exposure to other wrestling. But I think the majority of kids were big fans of the WWF. Yes, there were fans of the NWA at the time. I didn't have a lot of conversations with 8-year-olds about the NWA. I just didn't. It was all about Hulk Hogan. It was all about the WWF. It was all about the action figures. But as a result of cable, I got to see all kinds of stuff. And back then, I was just a fan of wrestling, and I would take as much as I could get. I didn't discriminate against wrestling. If it was wrestling, I was going to watch it, and I was going to get to know it, and I was going to follow it. So WWF obviously was a mainstay. We had WWF Championship Wrestling, which of course became Wrestling Superstars or Superstars of Wrestling. We had All-Star Wrestling, which became Wrestling Challenge. We had a really almost a C show, I think, called Wrestling Spotlight, and that was odd. That was like a recap show, I think. We had Primetime Wrestling. We had Tuesday Night Titans. We had the Saturday Night's Main Events, of course. We had the house shows on Madison Square Garden Network, and our upstate New York cable was dominated by the WWF, but one of the first cable channels was TBS, and TBS was on. If you had cable, you had TBS. It was part of the package. Part of the really early initial cable lineup was TBS, and so you had NWA wrestling, and the NWA wrestling was obviously Saturdays at 6:05 p.m. and that's for a wrestling fan. 6:05 p.m. is it's tattooed in our brains. It's a common phrase, Saturday, 6:05. The NWA also ran on Saturday mornings, and they also ran on Sunday nights at 7:05. One of them was called Worldwide, right? So NWA Worldwide or NWA Pro or whatever, there were multiple shows. And then they would also run, starting in '88, they would run their Clash of the Champions. on TBS, kind of like their Saturday night's main event. But there was so much more. There was so much more, and I got to discover it totally accidentally because I guess at 8, 9 years old, I don't think to back in the TV guide days. Usually it would just say wrestling in the TV guide. It wouldn't tell you what or who, or it would just say wrestling. So I don't know how I discovered it, but in the early 80s, mid 80s anyway, I got the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, out of Minnesota, Vern Gagne's group. I would get that after school at 4 p.m. on ESPN. Would be AWA Wrestling, and it was from the Showboat. I remember the Showboat in Atlantic City. I think the Showboat Hotel and Casino. I don't know. I think that's so cool that that the AWA was filmed out of, I assume, a ballroom on the Showboat boat or the casino. Well, no, it's not it is a showboat. There is a boat, but I think the Showboat Hotel and Casino is a building, or is it a boat? I don't know. But anyway, it was filmed at the hotel, which I thought was cool. Because when the guys would wrestle outside, you'd see like weird hotel carpeting on the floor, just like glow. So AWA, and I knew those guys from wrestling magazines, which will be next week's topic. But I knew those guys from wrestling magazines, from the ratings in the rating system in magazines, from the stories in magazines. So I knew, Greg Gagne and Rick Martel and Larry Zbyszko. I just knew those guys. And, it was a different kind of wrestling, and I would watch it, and I loved it. And that's what I would do after school. Then ESPN had a weird schedule. A few days a week, they would air AWA. And then the other days of the week at 4, they would air World Class Championship Wrestling. And then maybe some days of the week, they didn't air anything. It was just kind of a crapshoot. You didn't know. So I'd rush home on a Thursday or so, and at 4 o'clock on ESPN, and snowboarding would be on or something. Fortnite. Yeah. I think they're actually getting along and playing Fortnite, which is weird. They're still jumping. But World Class Championship Wrestling out of Texas, the Von Erich group, was also very different. And I got into it. Again, I just knew those guys from magazines. I knew them, and the AWA and World Class, they weren't super storyline heavy. The Von Erichs and the Freebirds, that was storyline. Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez, and so there were some storylines, but those were not regularly. Those were not. I think the AWA and World Class on ESPN were not like completely up to date shows. I don't think they were. So I don't think it was like weekly. I don't know. I don't know if it was up to date. I'm not sure where the companies were at that point in time and where their TV shows were at, but I don't think it was, how WWF was like, each week was a brand new show. Each week was up to date. They were building towards something. I don't think AWA and World Class on ESPN were necessarily, live. You know what I mean? But there was others. There was on the sports channel or the sports network out of New Jersey, I think it was the Mets station, was a group called IWCCW. So it was Joe Savoldi's group. And of course, Joe Savoldi was their champion. But Tony Atlas would wrestle there. And I remember that would come on so randomly on a Saturday. And for a stretch, for like 3 months, the sports network or the sports channel would just air the same show over and over again. And it was a Tony Atlas it was like Tony Atlas against Savoldi in the main event. They would just air it over, like something was wrong with the network, or I don't know what happened. Like the stuff that wouldn't happen today. So, and I think initially that was called ICW, International Championship Wrestling, I think. And then I think they connected with World Class somehow and became IWCCW. I don't know. But I found that. And that was bad. It was bad, but it was wrestling, and I was going to watch it. And from that group, I just remember Tony Atlas and Joseph Oldie, and then somebody named the Boston Bad Boy, Tony Rumble, was a manager / wrestler. We had Sergeant Slaughter and Tito Santana and Bruno Sammartino and Greg Valentine, like this group called the AWF, which was just awful, but it was wrestling. I never saw Southern wrestling. Obviously, I saw NWA, but I never saw, Mid-South wrestling with Bill Watts. I never saw Memphis wrestling with Jerry Lawler, because those are very territorial, and there's no reason for them to air in New York, right? So I didn't see them. I never got to see that stuff until now, actually. So now because of the Peacock Network, at night when there's nothing else to watch, I will actually put on. I'm alternating between World Class, starting in 1982, and they're both in 82. Yeah, so it's World Class 82 and it's Mid-South 82. I'm watching both. I just watch an episode a night or half an episode or whatever. And of the two, Mid-South is fantastic. And I know it gets better. World Class in 82 is actually very boring. They have a lot of really boring wrestlers like Al Madrill and Bugsy McGraw and, the Spoiler, and just really, really boring shows that the Texas crowd loves. They love this stuff. So it is fun to watch the crowd and, the reaction of the sportatorium. But Mid-South with Bill Watts. Bill Watts is awful on commentary. He's awful. But I'm getting some incredible matches. I am seeing Ted DiBiase at his prime. I'm seeing the Junkyard Dog in his prime. Paul Orndorff is fantastic in Mid-South. Brian Blair is fantastic in Mid-South. Who the heck else have I seen? Dick Murdoch is in Mid-South. It's just good. It's really good. 1982 Mid-South is good. And I think it only gets better. So I'm enjoying that. But I never saw that as a kid. I never had a chance to. I only knew those guys through magazines. And when I talk about magazines next episode, that's how I became such an eclectic fan was, when you were reading the magazines, almost like you didn't have to watch the show because you knew what was going on, and you knew who was in the group, in the federation, because of the ratings. You could see the ratings and you knew who was there. And I loved that. But being able to see it, is good. Being able to see it now is really fun, watching it through adult eyes. But that is it. That is wrestling memory number 7. New York's exposure to smaller groups, other groups, and how you could really get your wrestling fix pretty close to 7 days a week if you wanted. In a good week, in a lucky week where things lined up, you'd get 7 days of wrestling. And that was pretty great. So AWA, World Class, IWCCW, WWF, and NWA, and Glow, of course. And then the smaller, short-lived, AWF and things like that. But that's that. Wrestling memory number 7. Exposure to multiple different groups as a kid. That is all. See you tomorrow. Good night now.